Faces of Modern Slavery, next on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs at UWM and Milwaukee Public Television present International Focus, a global magazine linking Wisconsin and the world.
Welcome to International Focus. I'm Doug Savage, Assistant Director of the Institute of World Affairs at UWM. Many people think of slavery as a regrettable historical practice which a more enlightened human society has managed to end. In reality, despite being formally illegal everywhere, slavery has survived in various forms and continues to support many enterprises in the global economy. To help us understand the plight of the victims of 21st century human bondage, we're joined by a writer who has traveled the globe to get their stories. Benjamin Skinner is an author and activist in the global fight against the trade in human lives. His book, A Crime So Monstrous, Face to Face with Modern-Day Slavery, has earned accolades from figures such as Elie Wiesel and Bill Clinton. He previously worked as a writer for Newsweek International. He's presently a fellow at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Benjamin Skinner, welcome to International Focus.
Thanks, Doug. Good to be with you.
Well, I think the place to start would be to get your definition of slavery.
Sure. When people think of slavery today, they often think of sepia-tone photographs from the past, or they think of slavery as a metaphor for undue hardship. If you look up in Merriam-Webster dictionary, the first definition is drudgery or toil. That's not my definition. That's not the International Labor Office's definition. It's not the definition of one of your previous guests, Kevin Bales. I adopted his definition. Slaves are those forced to work, held through fraud, under threat of violence, for no pay beyond subsistence. And by that mere definition, there are more slaves in the world today than at any point in human history.
Well, let's talk a little bit about sort of the parameters. I mean, is there a geographical focus to it? Who are the slaves? What kinds of activities are they pressed into doing?
Sure. Slaves are today in any manner of low-level industry, in agriculture. They are in fisheries, in brick kilns and quarries. They are also in forced commercial sex, and they are children forced into any form of sex. They are, if you were to plot slaves on a map today, the vast majority of pinpoints would be on the Indian subcontinent, in India, in Nepal, in Pakistan, in Sri Lanka, to a lesser extent in Bangladesh. These are people who are held in some form of debt bondage, typically. And in many cases, it's generational debt bondage.
And what are the connections to these enterprises, the global economy? I mean, what contact, has indirect or otherwise, might the average consumer in Milwaukee have with slave labor?
Well, I think one of the vanguard piece of the modern abolitionist movement is attempting to get corporations to take responsibility for the supply chains of the products that they sell. And basically what that means is, if a corporation is manufacturing a product in the United States, it doesn't necessarily mean that that product is slave-free. Slave labor may be used on U.S. soil, as was the case in the Mariana Islands, as is the case with shepherds in Colorado, as is the case with farm workers in Florida and in California, factory workers in California as well. And B, the primary components of materials that are manufactured in the U.S. or in other countries can be harvested, can be drawn up from the earth through slave labor. Prime example, cotton. Bales that come out of Uzbekistan typically involve some form of child labor, and oftentimes coerced child labor, slavery.
So let's look in a little bit more detail about that supply chain. So you've got child slave input into the harvest of cotton. So who benefits along the line? There are several steps. Is it corporate, large companies, or is it somebody further down the line?
You know, it's in many cases, this is the great irony. In many cases, corporate CEOs of large multinational corporations are not feeling the direct benefit of slave labor. In other words, they aren't reaping extra large profits as a result of this. It's the subcontractor of a subcontractor, and they are still charging the same amount to the next person up the next distributor up the food chain, so. Essentially, it's in everybody's interest, except for that one exploitative subcontractor, but it's in everybody else's interest to rid that supply chain of slavery. So what I'm pushing for, and what as I say, the vanguard of the abolitionist movement is pushing for, is for corporations to take responsibility for the slavery in their supply chains. Not necessarily that they be held culpable. Under U.S. law, under the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, they could be held criminally responsible. What I'm saying is it's important for corporations to establish that their products are slave-free because it makes consumers more comfortable, because the market ultimately rewards transparency. And in California, there's a bill in the state Senate at the moment, which I think Wisconsin would do well to emulate, which essentially says any products sold in California markets should have the slave-free label. And there's an opt-out for that. Companies can say, we don't know what's in our supply chains. And then consumers can choose to purchase a product that is guaranteed slave-free, or choose to take a risk and perhaps pay a lower price. I think ultimately the market will reward transparency, and consumers will make the right decisions if they're empowered with the right information.
Well, if the corporate entities can say, well, what goes on further down the supply chain is something we can't possibly monitor, who ultimately can certify something as slave-free?
You know, ultimately it has to be the corporations. The buck has to stop with them.
There's I'm thinking the comparable to like some of the free or fair trade certifiers.
I'll give you a couple of examples. In Brazil, there's actually a slavery commission that goes in and investigates supply chains of, for example, in sugarcane production or in charcoal production. That's a government entity that goes in and does the job on behalf of all of us, really, on behalf of consumers. In other situations, for example, in West Africa, where there was the chocolate industry was heavily infected with slavery in the late 1990s and early 2000s. After dumb journalists like me went in and made those corporations, those chocolate companies famous, the chocolate companies said, well, we have a real PR problem here. Let's get together and let's form a protocol a la what the major diamond industry leaders did with the Kimberley process. And ultimately, that protocol in the chocolate industry it's not perfect. And it really took some arm twisting on the part of Senator Harkin, basically using the Farm Bill as leverage. But they got it done, and it's a starting point. Slavery still exists in the chocolate industry, but not to the extent that it used to. And what you have to a much greater degree are thriving cocoa communities, which is the idea. Targeted boycotts, extremely targeted boycotts, can work sometimes, but wholesale commodity boycotts are not what anybody wants.
Right. Well, we've said slavery is formally illegal everywhere, and this isn't 17th or 18th century North America where economies are dependent upon it. So you said there's really just a small number of exploitative employers who are benefiting. So where's the obstruction to actually eradicating it?
I think it's in the fact that partly because of the laws, because my ancestors who were Quaker abolitionists and those who weren't Quakers took up arms and fought with Grant's army, you know, we consider that their sacrifice, in many cases their blood sacrifice, I mean 360,000 Union soldiers died to enshrine the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment, we consider that that sacrifice did the job. And today we are happily living in a world free of slavery because we don't see it in open air slave auctions the way that we could in the southern states in the early part of the 19th century. The sad fact is that we are actually very close to being able to negotiate in broad daylight the sale of slaves. And I was able to do this on 4 continents. I had a principle of not paying for human life, and I never did, but I wanted to go through all of the steps in order to expose the trade and to get a sense of the cost of how much human beings go for in the modern world. And let's say that we're in the center of the moral universe here in Milwaukee. We're really some 8 hours from being able to negotiate, as I did on the street in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, the sale of a 12-year-old girl. The asking price for this girl, first of all, I made it clear that I wanted this child for domestic slavery. According to UNICEF, there are some between 225,000 and 300,000 children ensnared in domestic slavery, cooking, cleaning, carrying water in Haiti. And this was January 11th. This was prior to the earthquake. When I went there, I went there in October 2005, I made it clear that I wanted this child for domestic slavery. This was in an open-air discussion with several men whose business it was to do this. They called themselves courtiers, brokers. The asking price for this child was $100. And at a certain point, the trafficker leaned in and said, "This is rather a delicate question, but would you want this child as a partner as well as a domestic slave?" And my translator made it perfectly clear what he meant by partner. And again, for those hundreds of thousands of children that are ensnared in domestic slavery in Haiti, sexual abuse is part and parcel of their bondage. And the negotiated price within 2 minutes was $50 US.
And
I didn't buy that person. I didn't buy that person. I didn't buy the young woman that I was offered in exchange for a used car in an underground brothel in Bucharest. I didn't buy the 2 girls, 15 years old, that were offered to me for sale this last summer in the shadow of the World Cup Stadium in Bloemfontein, South Africa. I always had a principle of not paying for human life, with the idea that by doing so, I would be giving rise to a trade in human misery. What I did do was I would always take the information that I had to local authorities to press them to build a case against the traffickers and to liberate whatever individuals may be ensnared in slavery in those situations. I have to say that in some of the cases, I felt that there was movement, there was action. For example, in South Africa, the trafficker that offered me those 2 girls is now a fugitive from justice. In Haiti, the trafficker fled to the United States. As far as I know, the young woman that was offered to me for sale in Bucharest, it's interesting, I was speaking to the former Romanian president last week and brought up her case, and he said, you know, these are the Roma, these are the Romani, and they have their own laws, that's something in their blood. I think that attitude and that degree of dismissiveness towards a people because we assume that they're predisposed to criminality because of some ethnic trait, I think that is what gives rise and gives cover to the kind of expansive reach of modern-day slavery in the world today as we see it.
Well, when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about sort of the situation post-emancipation, if we could. But in the meantime, we'll take a short break. We'll be back shortly on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus. We're talking with Ben Skinner about the faces of modern slavery. Well, you know, we talked about the very narrow levels within the supply chain that supports modern slavery that actually benefit from it. Who benefits from sort of large-scale emancipation? I mean, is there sort of a freedom dividend?
There certainly is a freedom dividend, and I'm glad you're using free the slaves term, Kevin Bale's term in particular. The freedom dividend essentially is the upcycle of development that happens when you not only bring individuals out of slavery, but whole communities. For example, in northern India, you begin to get women and girls educated at higher rates. You get more productive. You get a greater percentage of the population that are productive. You get people earning income for the first time in their lives and keeping the products of their labor. Something remarkable happens when you bring people who have not been earning anything and bring them, help them rise up to even the moderate poverty level of $2 a day. At $2 a day, people actually start to buy things over the course of a year. They start to contribute to the economy. They work harder. They're more productive. Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations had presaged this when he said that slavery is the dearest form of all labors, because only through sheer force can you extract enough work from an individual in order to turn a profit. There are much better ways to turning profits than slavery, much more effective, much more efficient ways. And so as we do a sales job of abolition, and it's officially the role of the U.S. government to monitor and combat human trafficking. This is a mandate put forth by Congress in 2000. As we do that sales job, as we push for monitoring and combating human trafficking, we have to make cases to countries like India that this is in their economic interest to eradicate slavery. And
do you ever find you have to make that case to the people who are enslaved themselves? I mean, is there a mindset that you have to overcome?
Absolutely.
I mean, you talk, for example, about generational debt bondage.
Right, right. You know, in a situation like India, where generational debt bondage is so rampant, you know, by Free the Slaves estimates, there may be as many as 20 million, 10 to 20 million, it's a big range, in debt bondage in India. According to the ILO, it's more like 8 or 9 million. But anyway, you're talking about massive numbers of people in debt bondage. One of the reasons for the persistence is because slavery becomes a system of codependence, in a sense. And I'll take an example from the book. I went in and was talking to a man who had been enslaved for, he was a third-generation slave. His grandfather had taken a debt of the equivalent today of 62 cents. And 3 generations and 3 slave masters later, that the principal on that debt had never been touched. In theory, he was working just to pay off some of the interest. In practice, he was illiterate, he was innumerate, he didn't keep the books, and the person that forced him to work was known by local police to be a serial killer, was known by local police to have killed 4 high-caste Brahmin Indians. They were known by the slaves in the quarry to have killed at least a dozen of the villagers, a dozen of the slaves. So he and his entire family were forced to work in this quarry, taking rocks out of the earth, pounding those rocks into gravel, used as a subgrade for India's roads, and pounding that gravel down into handmade sand. And as Kevin has put it, there's only one way that you turn profit off of handmade sand, and that's through slavery. And when I asked this individual, who for the purposes of the book I called Ganu, as far as I know he's still in bondage, and so I wanted to protect his identity, when I asked him, why don't you leave, why don't you walk away, I did so because I'd been reading the writings and the speeches of Mahatma Gandhi, and the Mahatma had this beautiful phrase about slavery where he said, the slavery and freedom are mental constructs. When a slave decides not to be a slave, the bond is snapped and the fetters fall. And so I asked Ganu, why don't you leave, why don't you walk away? The second thing he said was, if I left, I would be found. Ramesh would track me down. He would beat me up. He would kill members of my family. He would force me back to work. But the first thing that he said was, where would I go and how would I eat? And that is an incredibly important facet of modern-day slavery to understand. For Ganu and for that entire village, slavery was no mere mental construct. Slavery was their world. And Ramesh Garg, their master, was God in that world. He was not only the taker of life, but he was also the giver of sustenance. And so when we think through ways to comprehensively abolish modern-day slavery, we have got to think about how to break those cycles of dependence. And I'm glad you led with that term that Free the Slaves uses, because they are, to my eye, the vanguard, the best organization that is the leading edge of doing the targeted development work targeted at those communities that are already being targeted by traffickers to reduce the vulnerabilities, to free slaves, and to eradicate bondage over the long term.
So I would think the key driver of the abolitionist movement is just awareness. So if you would talk a little bit about your own journey and your own trip to that awareness.
Yeah, you know, it's one thing when I read Kevin's book, Disposable People, got his sense, and it's a very earnest, scholarly book that, again, puts that definition out there: forced to work, held through fraud, under threat of violence, for no pay beyond subsistence, as a definition of modern-day slavery. And he put out the number, 27 million slaves in the world today. It's one thing to understand the definitions and the numbers. It's another thing when you're in this underground brothel in Bucharest, and you're offered a young woman in exchange for a used car, and this young woman has the visible effect of Down syndrome, has slashes all over one of her arms where I can only assume she was trying to escape daily rape the only way that she knew how, by killing herself. And the trafficker, in an attempt to make her sellable, had put makeup on her very quickly, and she was crying so hard that the makeup had run. In a situation like that, you begin to understand the phrase that supposedly, unfortunately it's oftentimes the worst people that have the best quotes, but Joseph Stalin was supposed to have said that the death of 1 million men is a statistic, the death of one man is a tragedy. And my point in writing the book, my hope in writing the book, was not to count all the slaves in the world, but was to show what their slavery meant.
And other than reading the book, what would you recommend the average viewer do?
Well, I think one thing is tell others about it. And if everybody watching pledges to tell 10 people by the end of the month, then you have a movement. In fact, you have a movement just in that one little subunit that was the same size as the original abolitionist movement in 1787. 12 people sitting around a table deciding, as Kevin so well put it, to overthrow what was equivalent in scale today to the global automobile industry. That's what it takes. Never doubt, as Margaret Mead said, the capacity of a small group of committed citizens to change the world, and pushing now. Being committed, being moved on this issue is one thing. Pushing in the right areas is another thing. And it's absolutely essential that that legislators fund the fight. And I think I would love to see, in the La Follette tradition, I would love to see Feingold, who is quite good on these things, and Cole, who is supposedly nobody's senator but your own, and if this is something that is important to the citizens of Wisconsin, it'll be important to Herb Kohl, and it should be important to Russ Feingold. I would love to see them push for more funding. Right now, the federal outlays for the fight against the traffic in human beings for an entire year are the same as the federal outlays for the fight in the traffic in illegal drugs for a single day. And that's not to diminish the relative horrors of smoking pot, but it is to say, which is the more monstrous crime? Is it a 15-year-old selling pot on the street corner, or is it a 15-year-old being sold for rape and destruction on the street corner?
So is there any specific legislation on the horizon? Or?
We're in appropriation season right now. I'm forgetting the budget numbers specifically. They're still too low, but I think it's something like 6.8 million. But just getting that through as supplemental would be a step in the right direction.
Well, I'll leave it to our viewers to do their homework and look up the specific legislation.
Excellent.
Ben Skinner, thank you so much. The book, once again, A Crime So Monstrous. We'll see you next time on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,